We're now moving on to Professor Rosie Campbell. I first heard Rosie speak at the Maritime Command NATO's Inspiring International Women's Day event earlier this year, when she mentioned how important it is to signal to women that they're wanted. As a professor of politics and director of the Global Institute for Women's Leadership at King's College London, and someone who's presented 8 episodes of Radio 4's Analysis, I think she's extremely well qualified to speak. Rosie, over to you.
Thank you, Angela. Well, hello, everybody, and I'm really glad to have followed Louise, because I think Louise has given us a fantastic example of how important the signal is, and I was sitting there reflecting. I've never really paid any attention whatsoever to competitive sport, and I think that's partly just because when I was growing up, I thought, oh, boys don't really want us involved in that. It's not. I just kind of completely disassociated myself. My 2 girls are very, very sporty, and my younger one plays football all the time, women coach, and I just suddenly realised the signal we've sent to girls is, you're wanted, this is for you. And as soon as you send that signal, suddenly it's not girls don't want to play, girls aren't really interested in football, they don't really want to play. They do want to play if they feel wanted. And that's what I'm going to talk about now, is about how do we create that signal? Because in the field that I'm a political scientist, in the field I work in, sometimes political parties will tell you, oh, the women just aren't out there, they're not interested. There is a lack of supply of women. Actually, the real problem is the lack of demand for women. We're there, we just need to feel like we're wanted. So as Andrea mentioned, I'm the director of the Global Institute for Women's Leadership at King's College London. I'm just going to give it a little plug before I launch into my main talk. My boss is Julia Gillard, the former Prime Minister of Australia. Some of you might be aware of the really horrific time she had when she was in office. The press really gave her an awfully hard time. A shock jock talked about her needing to be kind of put in a bag and drowned, the kind of things that actually, sadly, with social media, we're pretty used to now. And at the end of her time as Prime Minister, she reflected on to what extent was the treatment she'd received just the way politics is, the way she was coming to office, and to what extent was it because of the fact she was a woman. And what she discovered was there was more research about the barriers to women's leadership and the stereotypes women face when they're in leadership positions than she realised. But a lot of that was hidden in academic journals and not very accessible, but there are also gaps. And so she founded the Institute to break down silos, to share knowledge about what we can do to increase the pace of change, and to do that in a interdisciplinary and global way. So you all know this. We know there's been lots of progress towards gender equality, with women around the world more likely to be in higher education and paid employment. But it's just not translating quickly enough into women's leadership. And in fact, in some sectors, it's even going backwards. So for example, in the IT sector, traditionally women were fairly well represented. The numbers of women in IT are actually going down, not up. But the current landscape is one where there's lots of people and organisations like those represented in this room who really care about this issue, are spending lots of time and energy on trying to make a difference. But we're actually not necessarily all learning from each other. And what fantastic examples we've had already this morning about how we can make change happen. And we really want to replicate what you're doing here today, which is all learning from each other. What has worked? How can we make that case for change more effectively? How can we speed up the difference that we want to see made? So we're all about resourcing change makers like yourselves, breaking down silos, bringing researchers, activists and practitioners together, challenging those stereotypes. It's one thing to get into a leadership position, but what happens when you're there? Are you treated equally and fairly? And of course, all with the best possible evidence. And if you're interested, we have a podcast hosted by Julia. We have lots of face-to-face and online events. And this is the end of the plug. If you're interested, please go to our website and sign up to join our network. Now I'll move on to the main bit of my discussion. So The couple of themes. So when Angela contacted me, she really wanted to talk to me about the importance of signals. And I had to really think hard about to what extent are signals key in the work that I am familiar with. And I think that there are two ways that signals are really important in the workplace. One of them is how do we signal confidence and competence, and how do we measure competence? And the other is how do we signal an inclusive environment? I'm a huge fan of Thomas Chamorro Pre-Muzak. If this is the first time that you've heard of him, go and look at his TED Talk. He has a book called Why Do We Keep Promoting Incompetent Men? It's deliberately provocative. And what he argues is that the most talented men and women often don't make it to the top of organisations because what we tend to reward is confidence rather than competence. So those people who exude confidence are very often promoted, even if they're not the people who are the most effective at their jobs. And this is a barrier to competent men and women being promoted. But because in our society, men are on average slightly more likely to be overconfident than women, we tend to see more men reaching the top if that's what we reward. So I really strongly recommend going to have a look at that book. And I personally, when I started in this role, the director of women's leadership, the Global Institute for Women's Leadership, a lot of people thought that we would be running training programs for women and we'd be making women more confident. I really think that this room is absolutely stuffed full of confident women, and I don't personally think that that's where the problem lies. I think the problem lies in having too many overconfident people in the workplace. And I think if you can think back to having had a boss that you think might have been difficult to work for, were they underconfident or overconfident in their own abilities? Anybody got any thoughts about that? Underconfident. If your most incompetent boss, were they underconfident? Hands up. Your most incompetent boss, overconfident? Hands up. That's the problem, right? We need to reward confidence, not competence, not confidence. And so we're not about making women better leaders. Women are already fantastic leaders, but we need to send really strong signals in the workplace that what we value is competence to deliver good results, not your confidence in terms of presenting to a boardroom or whoever else how wonderful you are. We can actually measure people's performance much more effectively than relying on our self-reports and how good we are ourselves. And I think this is really key, and this is something that Thomas Chamorro Pre-Muzak talks about. He talks about transformational rather than transactional leadership. Transformational leaders are people who are interested in the development of their team. They're interested in the whole group's performance, the collective purpose. They're not just interested in their own self-promotion. Of course, we need to focus on self and others. This isn't about self-abnegation, but actually really transformational leaders, leaders who can bring about the kinds of changes we've been hearing about this morning, are people who bring people with them and who really care. And they really are good at problem solving, completing tasks, but they do it in a collectivist way. Now, men and women are both transformational leaders, but again, there's slightly more women in the transformational leadership category just because of the way we're socialized. Whereas transactional leadership tends to be much more focused on the individual's personal rewards. I sort of feel that the ultimate transactional leadership on the world stage at the moment might be Vladimir Putin. If you try and think about what are the problems of running something the way Vladimir Putin does, well, it's so hierarchical and it's so individualist and narcissistic. How do you bring problems to a leader like Vladimir Putin? How do you say to him, you know this plan you've got to invade Ukraine? Like, we're not really ready. You daren't, because you're going to be, it's over for you in your career. That's an extreme example. But transformational leaders are people who you can bring problems to and they don't shoot the messenger. They say, right, I've heard you. What can we do about this? Let's fix it together. So these are the kind of things we should be rewarding in an organization. And if we send the signals that this is what we value people who really make a difference, who work collectively, who care about their teams, actually, and if we have processes that reward and measure that kind of behaviour, we see more women recruited into leadership positions without necessarily having to actively target women. Another way that we can signal that we undervalue transformational leadership is when we gender stereotype those kinds of behaviours. So if we send a signal that looking after, taking care of, thinking about the emotional support of your team is a lesser important job, there's this whole literature talking about the office mom, or in America, the office mom. Someone who remembers the birthdays, arranges the office party, actually knows if your mum's in hospital and mentions it. That can be seen as not the hard core business of your organisation and can be sidelined. We know that's the gel that makes the team glue together. We need to appreciate and reward the individuals who really think about their teams collectively. And so we shouldn't be stereotyping that's the kind of office mum role. We should be thinking, how do we actually include that kind of behaviour in how we reward individuals? So do we want the lone wolf or do we want the leader? And how are we actually measuring and signalling who is the more successful leader? Are we looking for people who are very collectivist and actually thinking about their teams, or are we accidentally rewarding the lone wolf who doesn't bring others with them? So that's one area of signalling that I think is really important. Another area is about when actual subjects or disciplines become coded as masculine or feminine. And of course, if we're thinking about women in defence, we can think about how defence is perhaps the ultimately coded masculine area of work. And what can we do about that? Well, I think a nice parallel is the issue of STEM education. And there's quite a lot of research showing that actually the way you make a difference isn't by going into schools and teaching girls that STEM is fun, that science is fun. Young girls, reception age young girls, know science is fun. They love science. But what happens, it's really like the example, I couldn't see who was speaking about their daughter earlier. It's like the example of I want to play, but they don't want me to play, so I'm going to back off. Actually, young girls enter school with a real interest in science. But if they get a signal that science isn't for them, they tend to back away. And the most effective solutions seem to be when you can de-bias the whole school environment. So many of you will be aware that girls tend to perform better in maths and science in all girls' schools. And the reason is it's not coded feminine. That's something, there are no boys there to claim that as their own. And in mixed sex schools, actually, if you can reframe things so that languages aren't seen as feminine, you can actually fix the problem with STEM. But you have to de-bias the whole school environment. You can't just pick off the one problem of STEM without realising what the underlying causes of the stereotypes are. Another thing that really seems to make a difference, which again has resonance with the messages that we've heard this morning, particularly around the Dove campaign and others, is that actually what's the deeper story? So some fantastic studies looking at engineering, MIT in the US, has shown that if you talk about how engineering can be used to change the world to make it as a better place, you get as many women applying as men. So the messaging is really, really important. What signals are you sending when you are recruiting? And if the signals are ones that are perhaps seem to be coded masculine in a kind of engineering field, actually that's going to alienate women. Whereas if you send signals that this is about doing the things you really care about, you're really interested in, maybe you're really concerned about climate change and you can use engineering to help you fix that, that can make an absolutely huge difference. So what signals are we sending about what is the value and purpose of this work? Very subtle things like the kind of signals we send with our language can really matter. If you use language that talks about the hard-working environment, you'll tend to get fewer women in apply. Now, all of you in this room know that's not because women are lazy. I see heads shaking. The signal we get if we hear about a hard-working environment is that there's no work-life balance, that work is always going to come first. And actually work hard, play hard is even worse. If you hear a work hard, play hard signal, you think, right, so the expectation is I put in a full day's work and then I go down the pub. When will I ever see my family? So actually thinking about how do you actually translate what it is that you want to signal to your recruits that they're going to get. And again, I think here it's about reward. intrinsic reward and value and purpose of what it is you're doing, but it's also about a reciprocal relationship between the employer and the employee. So yes, there are times when you need to give absolutely everything into your job, but you also need to signal as an employer that there'll be times when the job supports you. So that's going to be a reciprocal relationship. It's not always one-way traffic. And I would have thought that in some areas of defence, that's something that can really be conveyed. Actually, being in defence can be a whole family environment in which you can actually think about how do you bring those things together. But if all you see is the fun, or the hard work in some of those adverts I can think of, you see about joining the army, for example, people think, well, when do I sit down with my family? And actually try and convey that these things are compatible. Now, that's at the kind of actually recruitment stage, the signals you're sending to recruits. But there can be a problem with the signals that you're sending inside your organisation culturally, even once you've got the people there who've been attracted by the signals that your organisation sends. So this is an example of a study from Inside Policing, where these were women who had joined the Metropolitan Police Force. But after a couple of years in the force, what they found is that women were exiting, and all their excitement and their ambitions that they had had when they joined were declining. They were becoming less ambitious. And that was because they saw a lack of fit between their own skills and attributes and those they saw in the leaders around them. So if they saw themselves as being collaborative, social, and perhaps timid, and they saw a gap between themselves and the leadership, that reduced their ambition and made them more likely to leave. If the leaders were seen as mostly decisive, assertive, and arrogant, that had the same effect. So actually in our behaviour as leaders, that transformational leadership I was describing before, the one when you really are collaborative and team-focused, actually sends a very strong signal. This is an inclusive place where you can fit in to a wider group than if you have this very transactional kind of leadership culture. And then this is taking us back to my original point about politics. So I talked about political parties saying there just aren't enough women out there. Well, there's a very classic study that was written, I think about 30 years ago now, looking at the supply and demand of women into politics and trying to see, was the problem of the lack of representation of women in politics the fact that there were just too few women interested, or actually a lack of demand for them? And around the world, a huge number of countries have now adopted either legislative gender quotas in politics, where parties perhaps face a penalty if they don't have a certain proportion of women on their candidates lists, or as in the UK, individual parties can operate a quota. So the Labour Party since '97 has used all women shortlists, although they can't at the next election because they now have more than 50% women MPs, in order to create that demand for women candidates. But as around the world these quotas have been implemented, what researchers have found is it's not just that the increasing demand increases supply and creates this virtuous circle I was describing at the beginning. Because suddenly when political parties have a quota, such as the Labour Party having its quota for women candidates, women suddenly think, oh, the Labour Party's interested in me. It's very much like the football signal. I am wanted to play football. Maybe I will consider actually a career in politics when I had thought it was not for me. And so actually by showing that we want women, we increase the supply of women who consider themselves eligible to stand. And actually the research has shown that when you have quotas, sometimes there's an idea that quota women in politics will be less well qualified. There is no evidence whatsoever to suggest that's true. I mean, I have some problems with this research, which is often from the US, which suggests they talk a lot about quality candidates as candidates who've perhaps been lawyers and have been to Ivy League universities. I personally think in politics I'd like people from more diverse backgrounds than that. But if you take that narrow view, actually the women were more likely to have had more years of study, to have had those kind of professional backgrounds. So there's no evidence whatsoever that the women are less qualified, but what you actually see is this virtual circle where you start seeing more women being available for more senior leadership positions. And then looking at a much more local level, the studies in the US in India, which was a really rigorous research because it was a natural experiment. So in Indian villages, they allocated by lot, so randomly, women leaders in some villages and not others. So it was an incredibly powerful. It wasn't deliberately done to make researchers' lives easier, but it was like a randomized control trial. And what they found is that where there were more women in leadership positions, actually there were more women available in politics generally later on, and also amongst younger women in the area, there was more interest in standing for politics, standing for election. So that signal is so important in terms of actually showing women, this is an environment for you, you are welcome here, you're wanted here. And also, what are the results of actually bringing more women into organisations? Well, I'm sure many of you in this room will be familiar with the work of Caroline Corredo-Perez, perhaps all of you, so I won't say too much about it. But I think one of the most powerful statistics that she cites in that book is academic evidence from a few years ago that found that women were 17% more likely to die in a car crash than men at that time. And the reason for that was that all the crash test dummies had female anatomies. And actually, where your seatbelt sits on your body, etc., really matters in terms of your likelihood of surviving a crash. And I think many of you in the defence sector are familiar with the issues around uniforms, being the size for men and so on, and actually the kind of effect that can have on women. And this wonderful report from the 30% Club here in the UK looked at that from a business perspective and showed actually how organisations miss out on customers and suppliers when they don't have more women in decision making because they miss these things that actually seem obvious when you remember that at least half of humans come in a female form. And then just briefly, I think I've alluded to this already, but I think one of the important is when we signal inclusivity, we talk about gender equality, we often defer to parenthood. And I'm not suggesting that's everything, because actually, of course, we all know what's going on in the BBC today, what's been going on in the CBI. Harassment against women in the workplace is a serious problem. But another really significant barrier is the fact that women still do the majority of the unpaid caring work. And I've talked already about how if you talk about a hard-working culture without talking about work-life balance, that can send a signal. If you have got other responsibilities, this is not the place for you. And we've looked at research looking about flexibility and trying to understand, actually, when can we signal that we really are a flexible employer? And actually, flexibility, there's been a sense that for office workers after the pandemic, that suddenly there's going to be this wonderful new environment for those with caring responsibilities. But actually, I'm sure many of you know that what parents often need isn't flexibility, it's predictability. It's knowing if my pickup is at 6:30, there'll be the odd occasion when I can call and ask a friend or I can pull somebody else in. But if it's my turn to pick up, I need to be there. And so actually this idea that flexibility is everything doesn't necessarily work if that's it's flexibility to be available all the time. And that's when we return to this idea of a reciprocal relationship with your employer. They will support you and you will support them. And there's huge, there's what's called in the, when I talked about there's the motherhood trap in work. So as well as having the office mom, there's the motherhood trap. And what often happens is that when women opt to work part-time in order to combine work and family, there's almost no promotion if you look around the country. We have this two-tier workforce where people are working part-time are just not rewarded in terms of promotion and pay for what they bring to an organisation. So there might be some roles that you really cannot offer the kind of predictability or flexibility that parents need. And so they will choose the schedule control that they can have by working part-time, and then they will get stuck. And then your organisation misses out on actually having the most able people in those roles. And so actually thinking about, how do we measure output? Could someone do this job part-time and be promoted? Could we have a job share in this role? It's really an important way of thinking about how can we signal that we really value all our workers, not just those who are on the full-time track. And this does matter for men and women. When men, the signals we send about how we are an inclusive environment, men often, especially younger men, are more interested in being involved with their children in a more in a more time-consuming way than previous generations perhaps even thought was possible. But actually, if you signal in an organisation, you will not seem to be committed to your work if you take parental leave, if you actually leave to go and see the school play, then men will not make use of those opportunities. And there was a fantastic study run by the Behavioural Insights team where they did a real randomised controlled trial with Zurich Bank, and they advertised all jobs as full-time, part-time, flexible or job share. And they saw a 16.4% increase of women applicants, a 19.3% of increase in women applicants to senior roles, and an 8% increase in part-time workers' sense of belonging. And we've gone back and talked to Zurich Bank about this study, and actually what they saw was an increase of women applying into full-time roles. So the signal was just as important as the policy. Women who wanted to work full-time were not applying to be promoted inside Zurich because they thought, if I take that promotion, suddenly I'm going to lose all control over my diary. And this is one thing that I've noticed. In many organisations, the more senior you are, the more control you have over your diary. But too often that's kept quite secret. You know, there's an EA who's kind of putting in that little trip to whatever it might be, and it looks like you're always busy, you know, your diary's always blocked out, but some of that's personal stuff. That is so problematic because people underneath think, I can't work like that, I can't live like that. And so it's so important for role models to show when they are balancing work and family life and sending the signal it is possible to be a whole human being in this organisation. You don't need to be 100% always at work. And then very briefly, because I think I've only got a couple more minutes, I've talked mainly about flexibility, but also microaggressions send a really damaging signal inside organisations. So when we tolerate small, everyday acts of kind of undermining colleagues, when we think, actually, we'll just let that one go, we are creating an environment where we signal that bad behaviour is acceptable. A huge number of women report experiencing microaggressions in the workplace. I'm not going to read all these statistics out, and I will share the slides. But what those microaggressions do is they provide the foundation for much worse behaviour. And so if you think about those kind of everyday insults that women and women from ethnic minority backgrounds are more likely to experience than others, they provide the foundation, the signal to those toxic colleagues, you can get away with this. This is a culture that allows this kind of behaviour. And when you actually chip away at those lower level behaviours, you take away the ability for those abusers to perform the very worst kinds of abuse in the workplace. So again, a really important way where the signal is just as important as the actual policy itself. So you can have fantastic policies on the books about harassment and abuse in the workplace, but if your colleagues do not trust you that they are going to receive the kind of anonymous fair treatment that they need if they report something, and if they think actually here people don't take these kinds of comments seriously, they won't use those policies because the signal is not there that we value and respect you in this workplace and that we won't tolerate that kind of behaviour. So to wrap up, what really works is if we have diversity and inclusion as part of our core company or organisational values. They're not a nice to have done somewhere else. They're modelled by senior leaders. And that I'm not going to read all these out to you, but that we actually reward those individuals who are most competent in their jobs, who are inclusive, who are collaborative, and actually who's delivering, not how many hours are they seeming to be available, but actually what are they actually delivering for the organisation. So the signal can be as important as the policy itself, and they can really foster the environment where you have a more inclusive culture. And that in itself can actually lead to increase the supply of women being interested in working in that organisation, just as much as a targeted campaign would do.
Rosie, thank you so much. That was absolutely fascinating.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for your time.